Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, our updated expense reimbursements module. I'm Samantha. I'm the Director of Education with ClubExpress. Before we get started, we'll go over just a few pieces of housekeeping. All of your microphones and phones are muted, so if you have any questions about today's webinar topic, you are free to enter those in the chat. My favorite coworker, Devin, is hanging out in the chat, and he's going to be answering those questions for you. We will, of course, have time for live Q&A at the end of today's session, but again, you can ask those during the topics. Now, a recording of this webinar will be available within a few days on our YouTube channel. And of course, while you're there, you can browse some additional tutorials and webinars that we have posted in the past. So where's the recording again? Well, if you head to YouTube and search for clubexpress.com, that's with the .com spelled out, you'll find our channel, which includes all of our previous webinars and our tutorials. You'll make sure that you'll hit subscribe for notifications. I'm sure you will, because that makes sure that you get notified whenever we post a new tutorial or webinar recording. And if you're curious what else we post on social media, you can find more places to follow us at clubexpress.com. Now, when you're taking a browse at our previously recorded webinars and you're curious about what we have coming down the pipeline, you can check out all of those upcoming webinars at clubexpress.com/calendar. So today we're covering configuring and using our expense reimbursements module. We'll be covering documents in our document library next week. In November, we will be taking a break, and we'll explain why in just a minute. So when you're taking a look at those webinar calendars, take a look for December, or keep your eyes out for December's webinars, and stay tuned. We have some really exciting things coming down the pipeline. So we'll be hosting those towards the end of the year. So in November, we are taking a break from webinars to focus on our course event drills. So last week in our webinar, a lot of you had questions for our support team about where you can find more info about event drills and where you can register. So when you are signed into your website as an administrator or coordinator with access to the control panel, you can find a link to the course right from your support tab. So you can either go there or to clubexpress.com to learn a little bit more, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what the course includes. So when you register for the course, you and your administrators and your coordinators, your whole team gets access to the course. It's a course that covers a few weeks. It meets a couple of times per week, and the sessions are, of course, recorded. So while we do hope that you show up to each session, because we will build on the sessions as we go on, much like we did with some of our previous courses, you will be able to go back and view those recordings if you aren't able to make each session live. But of course, the benefit of showing up to the live sessions is you get access to my team. You get access to Devin and myself, ClubExpress experts, to ask them all of your questions about the event calendar that you have been dying to know. So take a look at the schedule, take a look at what we'll be covering in our course. It's the most comprehensive course that we've ever done on one of our modules, and it's, of course, for one of our most popular modules. Nearly everyone uses the event calendar, so why not kick 2024 off right and make sure that you have all of the tools in your pocket to make sure that your calendar looks great and functions well for your organization and for your members. So without further ado, we will hop right into our topic for today. So I'm going to go through a bit of an overview of what the expense reimbursements module is. Then we'll talk about what we're going to be demonstrating in today's webinar. Now, expense reimbursements is one of our extra cost features. So that cost is $25 per month at the time of this webinar. So you always want to make sure if you're taking a look at this webinar way in the future that you double check pricing at clubexpress.com/pricing for the most current price on the module. Right now, that price is $25 a month. And what you're able to do with that is configure different expense types and categories and allow members to submit those expenses for reimbursement by your organization. You can have a set of administrators or coordinators that have approval rights over these expenses, and they can be tasked with reviewing any aspect of the expense reimbursement, providing notes, and even managing the payment or the credit that would go out to that particular member. You can even link the expense reimbursements to events on your calendar. So if you are thinking about ways that you might be using expense reimbursements within your organizations, that event connection is optional. You certainly can use that, but you don't have to. So if you're thinking that most of your expenses as an organization aren't necessarily tied to an event, don't let that hold you back from maybe being able to use this module. We'll take a look at what that would look like and how you can manage different expenses that maybe aren't tied to an event that you've hosted. As I said, members can request reimbursement for any of those expenses, and they do that right from their member profile. So there really isn't a user interface to this particular module. The only thing a user would see is a member who's submitting for reimbursement through their member profile. Administrators also have the ability to add expense reimbursements to members. But again, we like to focus on members being able to do things for themselves. So we'll kind of go through that process. And as a final note, we'll talk about the different ways that you might want to consider reimbursing or crediting your members for those requests. So we'll talk about the ways that you can do that within the system and how you can make sure all of that gets squared away on your end and for your members. So the first thing that we'll be talking about today would be our module options. We'll go through those very basic setup options, make sure we get that module ready from the start. We'll start with our setup options. We'll configure our categories. You know that ClubExpress loves categories, and we'll also set up expense reimbursement approvers. So I've got that highlighted with a bit of a call out because there are some important notes to learn about expense reimbursement approvers. Got that all spelled out for you, so we'll go through that together. We'll talk about managing requests, and then, of course, we'll take a step back and look at things from a member side. We will choose a project or an event. We'll go ahead and submit a reimbursement request, and we'll take a look at what that experience is going to be like for your members. So let me go ahead and switch gears here. Give me just a moment. All right. Everyone should be looking at my Northwest Balloon Club website. I'm currently signed in to the Northwest Balloon Club as Martin Smith. Martin Smith is our favorite administrator. And what I'm going to do now is navigate to the control panel and find my expense reimbursements module. When you have the module activated, it'll be in the Money tab as it is related to finances, and you'll see it in your website modules section. I'll go ahead and click on reimbursements, and we'll start by orienting ourselves to just the screen that we see here. We see a very familiar search panel with the ability to search through different date ranges. Because this particular website is set up as a website or an organization that has subgroups, we do have different subgroups that we can sort of limit our view by. We'll talk about expense reimbursements for subgroups in just a moment when we talk about approvers. But for now, know that as a top level administrator, you have the ability to sort of break this down and view just one particular subgroup's expense reimbursement requests. I can filter by status, and we'll talk about what these statuses mean in just a bit, by my event or by the member who has actually submitted the expense reimbursement request. When I click search without entering any search criteria, I'm really looking at the last 3 months of reimbursement requests. So that's the default search range whenever you visit this particular screen. At the very top, I have options to export data from my expense reimbursement module, and this just spits itself out as a CSV export, so you can manipulate that in Excel if you'd like to, and my configure options. So before we take a look at some of the stuff that you're seeing in that grid of search results, I want to take a look at some of the things that we'll need to configure before we get started. Now, these are things that you'll want to kind of think about configuring in order, and there's a reason for that. So first up would be your reimbursement options. This is a screen that you should visit right when you activate the module for the main point of determining how many levels of approval you need for each reimbursement. So let's start at the top. How many days back do you want members to be able to select an event for potential expense reimbursement? We've selected 90. You can choose a different date range entirely. And remember that you don't always have to associate an event with this. So you can change that if you'd like to, or leave it as the default range. Supporting documents required. Members have the ability to upload receipts as part of their expense reimbursement request. And so you can determine whether or not that's a required option. So I have this selected as no. What that means is that members still have the option to upload a receipt, but it's not something that's required with every single reimbursement. So they can skip it if they need to. And last, the number of approvals before payment. Now, this is that point that I mentioned is really important that you figure out before you really get going within the module. It's not something that you want to change while you're accepting expense reimbursements and while you've started to use the module, because what that's creating is a number of times that something needs to go through an approval process, and it's applying different statuses when you have one level of approval versus two levels of approval. In this case, we've added 2 stages of approval. So that means that that expense needs to be approved 2 separate times before it's eligible to be reimbursed to the member. If you select one approval, that just means that one person needs to look it over before it's eligible to be reimbursed or credited to that particular member. And we'll kind of take a look at that. But again, the way the module is designed, you don't want to change that once you've already made the selection and begun using that module. So determine that within your organization. There's no right or wrong answer. We just give you both options. So depending on how large your organization is, you might want a couple of different approvals with each expense. Now, once you've made your selections, you can go ahead and hit save. I'll go right back into my reimbursement administration screen. And once I've configured those basic options, now I can start those building blocks. I can configure my categories and my approvers. Your categories are going to be your basic expense reimbursement categories. These are going to look a lot like other categories that you'd configure on your site. These categories are going to be visible to members when they're creating those expenses. So you'll want to make sure that maybe they cover everything that you want to add. Maybe you even want to create a category that says not listed. And I'll add this in at the end. So you'll just enter in the sequence number for the display sequence. I believe our developers are working on adding in our standard display sequence button for this. But for now, you'll add in the individual sequence to reorder these items. Now you'll see that I added in one last category and I have the option to delete it. Much like many of our other categories, once that category is associated with an item in the module, you aren't going to be able to delete it. So some of these categories are already associated with reimbursement requests, and I'm no longer able to remove those from this screen. But adding those categories is really easy. Once I've added in my additional categories that I need, I've got categories for entertainment, equipment, webinar supplies. Really, these can cover anything in your organization that members are going to be asking for reimbursement for. We'll go back into reimbursement administration. And now is when we get into the piece that isn't very complicated, but there are some things to consider. And it's adding in approvers. Now, this kind of pairs very well with some of our recent webinars that we've hosted on the different levels of security that you might issue across your website and talking about different types of administrators and coordinators. So we'll talk about approvers and what their access looks like and what this really means for them. And we'll kind of pair that with some of the things that we've been talking about to make sure that you set up the right people with the right level of access. When we're taking a look at our approver administration screen, I see my approver name. These are people that I've already set up within my organization to be eligible to approve expense reimbursement requests. Now, we have the approver name. In this case, again, because there are chapters within this organization, we have a column for the chapter. Now, we have approvers who are able to approve expenses at the parent level of the organization. And we also have approvers who are only able to approve expenses at individual organization levels, for example, the district level, the region level, or the chapter level. And then we also have a column for their approval number. Now, remember that when we configured our options, for this case and for our demo club, we have selected 2 stages of approval. So that means that whenever we add an approver, we determine what stage they are an approver for. Now, we'll go ahead and select Add Approver. We can see what this looks like in real time. Let's go ahead and select a member from our list using our member selector. We'll go ahead and select Devin, and we can choose a subgroup. Now, Devin is going to be limited to the subgroup that he is already a part of to be an approver for. So we'll go ahead and select that, and that's a little subgroup note for you. And then I get the opportunity to determine my approval number: first approval, second approval, or both. Now, let's talk about what this actually means. Choosing an approval stage does not mean that the approver is limited to expense reimbursement requests at that stage. All it means is that that's when the approver gets notified that there's an expense ready for them to review. So let's put this into perspective. If I select second approval for Devin Trainer, when Devin gets notified, he's only going to get notified when the expense is ready for that second set of eyes, after that first stage of approval has already been completed. But when Devin signs in, Devin will see every single expense reimbursement request for his subgroup, even ones that aren't yet at his stage of approval. Because the approver designation, the approval number, only determines when you are notified. Again, it only determines when you receive notifications for the request. It doesn't determine what expense reimbursement request you're able to see. So if you want each of your approvers to get notified all the time, if you have an all hands on deck situation, you can say both, or you can keep things separate where you have certain people who are first stage approvers and others who are second stage approvers. I can go ahead and save this, and now we can see that I have my new approver. I have the chapter they're responsible for and when they're going to get notified. And I can go back in and change these anytime I'd like to. I can change the subgroup designation. I can also change the approval number. So let's talk about another facet of Let's talk about another facet of approvers. And for that, I just want to briefly take a pause and go back to my presentation here so I can break this down for you. Give me just a second. So when we have all of our approvers, we have approvers seeing every single request. We have them only receiving notifications for requests at their stage. And we also have some important information to note when you're looking at the different levels of access that your approvers might have and what they're able to do on your site. So when you have a full website administrator, someone like Martin Smith, approver status is only needed for notifications. So remember that approver status does not mean that that particular person can approve expense reimbursements at the first stage or the second stage. All it's doing is dictating when they receive those notifications. So your full website administrators don't need any special access to be able to manage expense reimbursements. They only need to be designated as an approver to receive those notifications. Module coordinators. And we talked about the differences between module coordinators, subgroup level administrators in some of our previous webinars. So we won't go through those in a lot of detail, but when you have a module coordinator, so someone who has been given coordinator access to the expense reimbursements module, they, again, only need approver status if you want them to receive those notifications. Otherwise, they can manage all requests at all stages because of their access to the module. With parent level administrators and subgroup level administrators, so we have a couple of different things. Parent level administrators can manage requests at all stages for the entire organization if they're a parent level administrator. And again, they only need that approver status for notifications. A subgroup level administrator does need approver status to manage requests and for notifications. Without approver status, all they can do is view requests. So again, subgroup level administrators are not inherently given access to manage expense reimbursement requests. They have view access, but you'll need to give them approver status in order to give them the ability to manage those requests. Now, at the top right-hand corner, you can see an example of what that approver notification is going to look like. So for all of you wondering, what does that look like for the approver when they get that email letting them know that there's an expense available? There's an there's a following reimbursement request ready for you to pay, and it lets you know what the very basic details are for that particular request. Now, there's an important note in that email that I want to call out to everyone. That's another important note about expense reimbursements and who can approve those reimbursement requests. So it seems like kind of an obvious thing, but you aren't able to approve your own reimbursement requests. So whether you're an administrator, a module coordinator, a parent level administrator, never going to happen. So if you have an expense reimbursement request that you need to have approved, you'll have to have an additional person in your organization manage that for you. So we'll take a look at it, but even as Martin Smith, we aren't able to approve our own expense reimbursement requests. A little bit of a conflict of interest there. So approvers are really, for the most part, needed just for those notifications. For the most part, again, as long as you have access to the module, you have access to be able to manage all of those requests, with the exception of subgroup level administrators. And again, if you are ultra curious about what all of those terms mean, we highly encourage you to go back and watch our previous webinars about website security and the different levels of access. So once we've taken a look at all of our approvers, so here you'll see that I have my approver list. I have all of the different approval numbers associated with them. Now that I have all of that squared away, let's go back to our reimbursement administration screen and see what is in our grid of search results here. Now, there really isn't anything else that an administrator can do up at the top here. We might be used to seeing a couple more buttons, but as far as what an admin is really doing on a day-to-day basis in the module, you're going to be hanging out for the most part in the maintain column of your search results here. So once you've configured your request categories, maybe you'll add another category here and there, but you really don't need to touch any more of these options unless you're adding categories or approvers. So in our search results grid, we have the date the expense reimbursement request was submitted, who it was submitted by, the title, which is just input by the member, the region that this might be associated with, or the district, or if your organization does not have subgroups, you won't see that column. The project associated with that particular expense reimbursement request, and the project is just the name that we use for the event that reimbursement may have been used for. And the status. Now, these statuses are also statuses that you can filter your search results by. So let's talk about them just a bit. Our pending status, and you can see that with a couple of our expense reimbursement requests there, pending status means that the member has started to create that reimbursement request, but they haven't yet hit that submit button. So as of right now, the only thing that we're able to do with that reimbursement request is view it as an administrator. I can't do anything with it until the member actually submits it. From the member's perspective, this is probably sitting in their member profile as a draft. Perhaps they lost the receipt and they need to go back and find it before they finally submit it. Maybe they need to add a couple more line items to the reimbursement request. The next status would be submitted. A submitted status means just that. The member has submitted it. It hasn't gone through any further approval just yet. It's waiting those first and second stages of approval. And then once you go through those approval processes, you'll start to see these statuses change. So what I want to do is go through that right now. We're going to take this new basket blanket expense and we're going to start that approval process. And another thing that I want to point out is that even though we've set up different stages of approval, we've set up different notifications for different stages, the same person could go through both stages of approval, and the system doesn't have a stop for that. So you don't have to create two separate approvers to go through these expense reimbursements. Martin Smith could come in here and conduct both stages himself, Or if your organization wants to set up one person for one stage, one person for another, again, you have that option, but you don't have to. The system will allow the same person to approve the expense. So I'll go ahead and I can view the expense request, much like any of the other requests. Let's go ahead and view that and see what that looks like. At the top left, I have my title, all of the basic information that I saw back on the maintain screen, who it was submitted to and who it's getting paid to, basic information about the expense, which was all submitted by the member. And I have the option to view the receipt that was uploaded. And we've just included one of our manuals. And right at the right-hand side here, I can see any request notes that have been added by any other administrators. I'm going to go back into the previous page here. Since I'm done viewing that expense reimbursement request, I'm going to go ahead and manage it. And I'm going to click the Review, Approve, Reject button. And you'll see that I have that button in a couple of other places, also in my submitted options. I'll go ahead and check that off. Now that my expense reimbursement request is essentially in edit mode, I have the ability to add in some additional notes here. Those notes will be visible to the member when they see that request as well, and they'll be visible to any other administrator who might sign in and complete any further stages of approval. So I can go in and say approved by Martin on 10/18. And I would say this looks great. I've already viewed the receipt, but let's say I view the receipt and I notice that it's actually $356, not $256. I can edit this amount as an administrator and change the amount. I can also change it to a different amount. Maybe I noticed that included in the $256, maybe she added something that we aren't going to cover. So I can say I'm going to cover $250 of this, and I can select approve. Now, I can also say maybe if there isn't a receipt included, I can reject the expense and it'll go right back to the member. I'm going to approve this, and we'll talk about rejection in just a second here. I'm going to approve this with the adjusted amount and with my note. I'll go ahead and select approve. Now, back on our reimbursement administration screen, I have a couple new things happening here. With my Colleen Carter expense, my new status is approved-2. That means that we are ready for that second stage of approval. We're ready to initiate payment. Now, when we have when we have rejected the expense, it immediately states that the expense is rejected, and the member gets an email letting them know that their request has been rejected. Once that happens on the member side, that request is not dead forever. The member can go in and make changes to that request, perhaps based on the notes that the administrator left. You forgot your receipt. You are missing a couple of line items. Please change the amount. All of those things can be included, and the member can fix them and send it right back to the administrator. Now we have a new icon in the maintain column, and that's our $ icon. I'll go ahead and select this. And now, because I have those 2 stages of approval set up, this is going to allow me to include my payment information. Now, we'll talk about payments and reimbursements in just a second. Let's talk about what we see on the screen here. At the very left-hand side, we have our basic details, and we also see now this claimed amount and the approved amount, who it was submitted by and who it's been approved by. And remember that I, as Martin Smith, am going through and submitting these approvals as the same person. So it doesn't need to be a different person going through the second stage of approval. I can go ahead and select my date. I'll select today's date. Now we're at the point where we have to mail out our check, and we have this little icon here to remind us to mail out our check. But there are, of course, plenty of other ways that you can handle payment or reimbursement to the member. So let's say that we are going to go ahead and mail out a check. We can enter in our check number, click save. The member gets an email letting them know that that's on the way, and our job is done. We, of course, have to mail out the check. But there are other ways that you can handle this. So perhaps in the payment notes, you want to say that you are instead going to credit the member to their account instead of mailing them a check. So we'll go ahead and save this. And I want to talk about what that would look like very briefly. It's not something that's really included in the expense reimbursements topic, but to kind of give you a quick idea of what that might look like. If I wanted to issue a credit to a member for an expense that they had incurred, rather than issuing them a check, I can go to the open credit screen. So I really don't have to go far from where I was with the reimbursement screen. I can select open credits, and I can find whoever I'd like to using my member selector. I'll go ahead and add credit, select my member, and then I can enter in all of the remaining information. So the dollar amount that I'm supposed to be reimbursing this person for, and the credit type. This was it for services? Was it for something that they purchased? And I can also add in the description what that's for. And that would be the place where I would note that I am reimbursing or providing a credit to that member for reimbursement of, and then you can certainly enter in a few details to help you pick out what that credit was for. So if your organization's hosting a couple of events coming up, or if the member just wants to save that to their account because they assume they'll use it with your organization in the future, that's an option that you have also. So keeping in mind that there are a couple of different ways that you can issue those credits to your members, a couple of different ways that you can handle your reimbursements. But the thing to keep in mind is that the system is not going to reimburse or credit those members automatically. There is that sort of manual portion on your end to handle that. Now, let's kind of talk about a couple of other things that we're seeing here. I want to take a look at Martin Smith's reimbursement request here, and I'll go ahead and select that review, approve, reject option. And you'll notice that even though I've selected the option to approve, I don't have the option available to me again, because Martin Smith can't approve his own reimbursement requests. I'll go back into my previous page, and what I want to do now is take a look at this from the perspective of a member. And I can certainly do that from Martin Smith's perspective because he's a regular member and because he actually does have a pretty true feeling of what this is going to be for a member because he can't approve his own requests. So when Martin visits his profile, he has access to expense reimbursements in his histories panel. The histories panel is usually where you'd find your transaction, payment, and credit history. It's also where you find any of your registration histories. I'll select expense reimbursements, and it'll take me to my personal expense reimbursement history screen, where I can see all of my past reimbursements. I can see anything that's been rejected, anything that's been previously submitted or saved. I can add a request. It's about the only thing that I'm able to do except manage previous requests. Now, you'll see that with my request that I've submitted, once I hit that submit button, I, as a member, can't go back and edit that request. So if the member has any changes that they want to make, you can reject the request and send it back to them to make those changes. But once they've pushed that out to an approver, they no longer have access to it. So I'll go ahead and add my own request. And let's take a look at what fields we're being asked for here. At the very top, I have my title. We will say that this was for new baskets. And my subgroup selection, I will select my top level subgroup because this was for a top level meeting as opposed to a meeting for a specific subgroup. Now, I mentioned that you can select an event that relates to the expense, but you don't necessarily have to. You can input a project name or whatever the expense happened to be for, not necessarily for a project. Maybe you just needed printer paper and someone picked it up from the local shop. So you can enter in something like NA, it was for the office, or you can select an event. Now, if I select an event, I am limited to the previous 90 days of events because that's what my administrators have selected. So let's say that I picked these up for a demonstration that the safety committee was doing for their September 5th meeting. So again, I have access to the previous 3 months of events, but you always, again, have the option to change that if maybe there was an expense that you were reimbursing from several months ago, as long as it's approved by your organization. Who are we paying this out to? Along with contact information that gets pulled directly from the member profile. And beneath that, I can enter in my individual line items, and I can also enter in a few notes if you don't have notes or if you don't have space in the description. So I can select the date that I purchased these, and we'll say it was the end of August from Betsy's Balloons. And they were baskets for the demo. And we'll call this our equipment. We'll categorize this under equipment, and we'll add in the dollar amount. And I can continue to add individual line items if I purchased multiple things for this particular occasion. And at the bottom, you'll see that I can add supporting documentation, but it isn't a required field for me. Underneath that, I can save this as pending. I can submit it. I'll go ahead and save this as pending. So you can see that within my list of expense reimbursement requests, I have a couple here. I can edit this because I've only saved it as a draft. I can view this or I can delete it entirely. Now, remember that even though I've saved it as pending, administrators can still see it, but they aren't able to do anything with it. So keeping in mind that pending doesn't necessarily mean that it's invisible to approvers. It just means that it's not something that they can approve or reject just yet. Now, that about covers it. Expense reimbursements is a smaller module. There, really aren't a lot of things that you would do with it apart from reimbursing expenses. There are a couple of those caveats, taking stock of who's an approver, what type of access they need. Of course, the fact that administrators can't approve their own expense reimbursement requests, and considering how you are offering up that reimbursement or credit to your members. Are you going to issue them a check? Are you going to credit them or reimburse them through other means? And I bet that we have questions. So, Devin, how are we doing on questions? And is there anything that we should share with the group?
Yeah, we've gotten a few questions, a couple interesting ones. One right off the bat that I actually wasn't 100% sure of. So to clarify, is there a way for a second approver to deny a request, or is it simply, are they kind of just there as the second pair of eyes on an approved request? They were
No.
asking.
So
Okay.
great question. So once we get into the second stage of approval, that reject has to happen at that first stage. That's a great question. So you'll notice, and let's go ahead and take a look at Manny's. So we get that reject option at that first stage. Once I approve it and it goes into that second stage of approval, I no longer have that option to reject. It's just an option to pay. So if you are going through those multiple stages, it's just at that first stage. And of course, if you only have one stage of approval, it's only happening at that first stage.
Okay. And then a couple other clarifying points. There were a few questions about can members request certain types of payments? They could, leave notes, but there's not like a toggle for send me a check, send me a Venmo or anything like that. And there were a few questions about are we able to credit directly to someone's credit card or checking card or something like that? That's also a no. We currently don't have a way to, especially if it's not tied to a transaction. I don't believe we even currently have a way to refund transactions directly to a credit card. That's something that we're working on getting back to. But especially if there hasn't already been a transaction related to it, there's not a way for us to, send money directly from your account to someone else's bank account. So it would have to be managed kind of like by check or credit or cash or, electronic payment, but that's entirely, between you and the member that submitted the credit. That has to be handled manually. Kurt had a really interesting question. It's another one that I don't know the exact answer to. Does the module integrate with QuickBooks? So are these transactions logged in QuickBooks in any way?
That is a great question that I also don't know the answer to, but it's definitely something that we can figure out, and we'll make sure to add that as a note in the recording as well.
Yeah, my gut reaction to that is I don't think it does, because these don't generate any sort of transactions in the normal transaction tracking system. If it does, I'm almost certain it does not. but we will have to double check on that, and we'll add a little addendum in here with some clarification once we put the video recording up. So we'll clarify that. You should be able to see that in the video recording. We'll find out about that. And then someone else mentioned, so if a second level approver does not want to pay it, does the approval just stay on the list, or is there any way to retract it?
There is not a way to retract it at that point. No.
If you submit it, can you then walk it back out? So like if we mark it as paid, can we then cancel that whole? I guess
So
they would have received an email once it.
well, yeah. So once you mark it as paid, they get an email saying that the member, excuse me, gets an email saying that it's been approved, and they'll get an email saying that the payment has been issued.
And I can't recall, did we cover? Can you walk back through the process for members creating a reimbursement request?
Yes. So the member navigates to their profile. And in the history section, we have our expense reimbursements link, which appears whenever you activate the module. So there isn't a toggle to turn that on. And from the member profile expense reimbursement screen, I have the option to add a request. If you don't have any previous requests, you won't see anything underneath it. And at the very top, I'm entering in all of the same information that I was seeing in all of my expense reimbursements. I enter in a title, and I can designate a subgroup because this organization has subgroups. If your organization does not, you won't see this drop down. I can also name the project or select an event that is associated with it. Remember, my events are only set to go back 3 months, but I don't have to. So this time I'll actually enter in, we'll just call this member meeting. I won't associate this with an event. And all of the following information is pulled from my member profile. Underneath that, I have that line item. This is what allows me to enter in one reimbursement item or multiple reimbursement items. So I can go ahead, select my date. Maybe I want to set this a little far back, and I'll categorize it and enter my amount, and I'll add that in. This is my spot where I'd enter in notes, and on the bottom, I can add in my supporting documentation. And because we didn't mark supporting documentation as required, I don't have to enter that in, but all I'm doing is just browsing my device, whether it's your phone or your tablet or your computer, enter in a title. I can just call this receipt. I'll choose a file from my browser. And once that's uploaded, and the file types are not limited to a specific type, you can enter images, PDFs. I happen to enter in a PDF. You can also add images as well. I'll go ahead and save that. And I can save it as a draft, which I've already done. I'll go ahead and submit this one. So the previous one that I added for new baskets, so that one's still in draft mode. It's still pending, and I haven't actually submitted that yet. I can go back into that, click that edit icon, and make some further changes. Or I can just save it as a draft and keep it as a draft in my sort of outbox. But those snacks that I added, those are going to be live. Because I'm logged in as Martin Smith, I'm not able to approve those reimbursement requests, but I can see them. So here are my snacks for the member meeting right at the bottom here.
Someone had a really great question I wanted to point out. So they asked if you would need this module to refund people for something like a canceled event. It seems like they're related, but no, this is a module specifically for reimbursing for outside charges. So if someone is going on a trip on behalf of the organization and they, pay for gas or pay for hotel stay or buy food, and the organization wants to reimburse them for those payments, this is a module you could use for things like that if that's something your organization deals with regularly. If you're talking about refunding payments for things that people do on the website, things like refunding members for their renewal dues, or if an event is canceled, all of those things are actually handled separately from this module. So this module is specifically for reimbursing people for outside payments outside of transactions on the website. We do have, I believe, some portions of that covered in a different webinar. Oh, I think we have a webinar specifically for treasurers, and we should cover the credits and like tracking transactions and canceled transactions in that webinar. And then we had someone asking Sam what the reports look like. I don't know if you have the reports server set up.
Yes. So we don't have reports built in for reimbursements, but we do have exports. So the options are reimbursement requests with line details or payment details. And we'll go ahead and run that for the top level. Again, because this organization has subgroups, we do have the option to narrow it down by a specific subgroup and a start and finish date. So I will back this up to the beginning of the year. And we'll run this and see what this gets for us. And we'll open this up and give that just a moment to open up here. And I will share my screen. And so this is an example of at least what the export looks like on our demo site. So we have, and I'll go ahead and make this a little bit bigger here. We have columns for pretty much all of the information included in the entire module. And these are for all of the expense reimbursements that have been submitted from the beginning of the year. And this is data that you can manipulate on your own. And this is our reimbursement details. So these are line item details as opposed to payment details, which is another example of what those exports look like.
All right. It looks like our questions have kind of died down a bit. So that might be all we've got.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate your attendance as always. Don't forget, we have a very exciting topic next week. We're covering the document library. So stay tuned for that. Don't forget to watch out for the Zoom link or go ahead and register in advance. Remember that if you register for webinars in advance, you can submit questions that you have and we'll cover them during our topic. So sort of an on-demand webinar, if you will. Again, the recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel in a few days. And with that, I gift to you 12 extra minutes of your day. Thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Bye-bye.